And if we include the Hebrew Bible, and they are our ancestors in the faith, then we have a faith story that goes back, roughly speaking, 4,000 years. And of course, in the scriptures particularly, is where our faith story originates. The Hebrew Bible and then the New Testament. But then after that, when the church got a bit organized, we had people come along called theologians. Duns Scotus, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and finally the Catholic Catechism. And finally, of course, Vatican Council II. So there's always been that sense of movement. It's not static story, but it's an evolving story that's growing and growing down through the centuries. And it apparently served people fairly well. It had its limitations, I have to tell you that right off the top. And in the 20th and the 21st century, those limitations became ever more evident, that there was a disconnect, a tremendous disconnect, a tremendous gap between life on Earth, life in the global village, life in the universe story. So truly the gap between, let's call it the theology, the story, there was a tremendous gap between the traditional story and what was happening in the world in the last 100 years. Certainly the last 50 years, a tremendous gap there. So what we're really looking at is that the only story? In the light of the new cosmology, in the light of the fact we know that our world is not a three-tier universe, flat earth, underworld, the dome in heaven, and God up above the dome, our imagination no longer is fascinated by the particular three-tier universe. And it has a lot to do with the theologians using their imagination in order to help this story evolve and to become more codified. So when I talk to you about the new story, it's borrowing from the traditional story, but some of it has to be discarded. Now I might as well be straight with you. Some of it has to be discarded because it's obsolete. And the fact is that for a large chunk of it, the traditional story no longer captures the heart or the imagination of young people. And when we talk about young people, we mean people under 50. So we realize then that this disconnect didn't start yesterday. I saw it starting in the mid-late 70s. So there you have the observation of an old man. Back in the middle to late 70s, I saw the disconnect starting to take shape as more and more young people found a disconnect. It no longer grabbed them, no longer spoke to them, no longer helped them to see. And so as a result of this, most of them voted, but they voted with their feet. They voted with their feet. They walked away. Now, I saw in the 70s there was a lot of anger because as a result of Vatican Council II, there were a lot of movements in the church to be more realistic and more connected and to make the church more the community of the faithful and not so clergy dominated, and changing the liturgy from Latin to English, and having women read the scriptures, have women serving Eucharist. It was just too much for some people, and they just weren't able to handle it, to cope with it, and even some of the, like I say, elders of the church walked away as well as the younger people who felt that tremendous disconnect between the story and their lived reality. Now, when I talk about the emerging new story, now I have to be honest with you. The new story, in a very real way, goes back to the beginning. Now, you may be surprised at that. You may think, well, if it's a new story, then it would have started recently. Not so. The new story goes back 14 billion years. Now, there's a leap for you. 14 billion years. Back to the Big Bang. Now, what was before the Big Bang? We don't know. We don't know. We assume God was there, okay, 14 billion years ago. And obviously, believers hold that God had something to do with the Big Bang, where spirit become one with matter. And once spirit became one with matter, now we are able to say that God is embodied in matter. God is embodied in all of creation. So then we have the evolution. Now, this has been a long battle. For a long time, people said, well, it's a theory. And because they call it a theory, they could say, well, we don't hold it. It's only a theory, so we don't have to take it seriously. As a result, you had a lot of people who would not believe in evolution. Just sounded too much. And the very fact that they thought evolution said that humans came from apes, and that was a little too much for a lot of religion people to swallow. If I could use that term, swallowing. Anyway, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is at the Big Bang, there's a whole new creation. Whole new creation. Spirit becomes one with matter, and spirit is embodied in matter. Now, of course, scientists are busy telling us what happened down through those 14 billion years. What happened during those 14 billion years? As time after time after time, evolution, and there's expansion, there's creation. We have things like the universe. Some scientists are saying today maybe more than one universe possible. And then within the universe, you have you have things like planets. You have the planets in our Milky Way, the sun and the moon and the stars, and all of those wonderful, beautiful planets that are circling up above us in their pathway, around and around and around. And as it went along again, eventually one of the planets that was developed, came together by gravity, was the planet we call Earth. Now here's something. When Earth is settled, comes Earth rather, then eventually with evolution and creativity, it begins to create. And it creates fish in the ocean. But even before that, there's a single cell in the ocean. And when that single cell somehow managed up on the beach, it divided, and now you have organisms. Now you have living organisms. The fish in the ocean, you have the grass, the trees, the animals, all of this over a period of millions of years. Over a period of millions of years, you have that continued moving forward into the future. Now, in doing this, of course, eventually, the Earth is able to sustain life. And not only sustain life, but Earth gave birth to life. So that everything on planet Earth is, in a very real way, an earthling. Psychosynthesis, which turns sunlight into energy and into plants and animals. And so we have that progression of evolution from the cell that came up out of the ocean and split to what we have today, a planet that is filled with life and thousands of life forms. And now I said that God is embodied in matter. So it really does follow then, if you use your imagination, that the Spirit of God is embodied in all of creation today. And everything is interconnected and interrelated. And what we do now, and scientists tell us this, that we look upon creation as organic. Organic. It's like your body is an organism. Every part of your body is an organism. And ideally speaking, we need everything that's part of our bodies for a full, healthy living organism. And every organ we have, our fingers and our legs and all our organs, are interconnected and interrelated. So it's one. And that's the big point I have to make. It's all one. And the divine is embodied in all of creation. And for us humans, who eventually, as our brains develop from a reptilian brain to our three other brains, and our front brain particularly, self-reflective animals appeared on planet Earth. Self-reflected consciousness. And those animals we cause, like Thomas called, rational animals. And so in very, very many ways, bodily, we are very like the animals. But we have the four brains. And with the four brains, we are able to reflect, to reason, to imagine, to have levels of consciousness, various levels of consciousness. So all of that comes with being human. Now, as far as we know, that scientists tell us that humans came out of Africa. That's where it seemed to have happened with the brains. And after a certain time, and I don't know how long, they immigrated from Africa into Europe, into Asia, and all those different places. And it may have been one tree, it may have been several trees. And some of the trees may have intermarried, and others may have simply died out. But nevertheless, it's very clear we came out of Africa and into planet Earth. And as Pope wrote in his encyclical, Laudate Si, the Earth is our home. This is our home. But it's also the home of all living creatures. And even what we might consider non-living creatures, if there is such. You might debate, is a stone alive or not? I think it is. I think it is. And then that brings us into, of course, the story of the Hebrew people coming home from Egypt to the Promised Land, people of the covenant, people who God said to them, I will be your God, you will be my people. So we have that Hebrew Bible, which a lot of people call the Old Testament, but it's the Hebrew Bible, talks about how that relationship between the Hebrew people and God worked itself out year by year, and all the transitions that they had to overcome. Then, of course, the story introduces Jesus. Now, in introducing the story of Jesus, it becomes another kind of a added ingredient to the whole story, that Jesus here.